Take that off!
Judge Everett Sloan's voice cracked across the courtroom like a gavel. The woman standing before him wore a faded olive tactical jacket, stained with old blood, scorched at the shoulder, and he wanted it gone before she touched his witness stand. Claire Donnelly said nothing. She simply stood straight the way soldiers do. That's when an admiral in the hallway stopped breathing. Stitched in black thread on her right shoulder, Phantom 4. He knew that call sign. 4 years ago in the mountains of Yemen, that call sign was the last voice his dying SEALs heard before they made it home. A nurse who never spoke about the war. A hero the courtroom was about to throw out. And the judge's arrogance was seconds away from destroying an innocent man's only chance at the truth. If you've never heard a story like this before, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the ones coming next. Now let's get into it. The emergency room at Pacific Mercy Medical Center did not slow down for sunrise. It did not slow down for shift changes for holidays, or for the kind of exhaustion that settled into a person's bones like concrete. Claire Donnelly had learned that truth a long time ago, not in this hospital, but somewhere far from its fluorescent lights and sanitized corridors, in a place where the difference between fast and slow was measured in whether someone came home or didn't. She carried that knowledge into every shift, and it showed in the way she moved, deliberate, unhurried, even when everything around her was falling apart, the kind of calm that younger nurses mistook for coldness until the moment they needed it most. She had been on her feet for 36 hours when the last ambulance from the Interstate 5 pileup cleared out. 17 patients. 4 critical. 2 surgeries she had scrubbed into when the attending physicians needed an extra set of hands that knew exactly what they were doing. By the time the department finally exhaled, the blood on her dark blue scrubs had dried to a rust color, and the clock on the wall read 11:47 in the morning. She had exactly 53 minutes to get across the city. Claire went to her locker without telling anyone where she was going. She pulled out the jacket. It was olive drab, faded to the color of old moss with a burn mark on the left shoulder that no amount of washing had ever been able to explain away. The cuffs were frayed. The chest pockets had been restitched at some point by someone who was not a tailor. On the right shoulder, pressed against a strip of worn Velcro, was a patch embroidered in black thread, Phantom 4. She put it on the way other people put on armor, not for warmth, not for comfort, but because some things you wear to keep the world from seeing what's underneath. She had not planned to wear it to court. She had not planned to wear it anywhere ever in a room full of strangers. But her clean clothes were at home. Home was 20 minutes in the wrong direction, and Mason Keene had been waiting 3 weeks for this day. She had met Mason 8 months ago through a trauma recovery program for veterans that operated out of a community center near the waterfront. She had gone as a volunteer, which was the only way she ever went anywhere that required her to talk about herself. Mason had been sitting in the back row, arms crossed, radiating the specific kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from the decision to stop fighting every room you walk into. He hadn't spoken during the group session. Neither had Claire. Afterward, when she was gathering her things and trying not to make eye contact with anyone, she noticed him watching her rotate her left wrist, the slow, careful rotation that meant the nerve pain was back. He didn't say anything. He just set a cold water bottle on the table beside her and walked away. She understood in that moment that he was someone who had seen enough pain to know when not to ask questions. That was the beginning of whatever it was. They were not friends exactly, but people who recognized each other. 3 weeks ago, Mason had been walking back to his car through the gas lamp quarter when he heard a woman's voice, tight with the specific terror of someone who knows that screaming will make things worse. He turned into the alley and found 3 men surrounding a waitress named Paige Moreno, one of them pressing a folding knife against the outside of her jacket. What happened in the next 45 seconds was not a brawl. It was the controlled application of training two men on the ground. One with a dislocated shoulder, one with broken ribs, and Trevor Langston against the wall with a fractured jaw and a shattered orbital socket. Then Mason had knelt beside Trevor, disassembled a ballpoint pen with his teeth, and used the plastic tube to open an airway before the man drowned in his own blood. Trevor's father, Harrison Langston, had made his fortune building things in this city and had spent considerable energy ensuring that the city's institutions bent in his direction. By the time the police report was filed, the knife had disappeared from the record. Paige Moreno had been visited by two men in expensive suits who suggested she take some time to think carefully before making any statements, and Mason Keene had been recast as a disturbed veteran who had attacked three unarmed men without provocation. The story had the shape of something plausible enough to stick. All it needed was for no one to push back. Claire was the only person willing to push back who also had the credentials to be believed. She signed out of the hospital at 11:52 and took the fastest route downtown. The San Diego County Superior Court building was the kind of place designed to make people feel small marble floors that echoed ceilings that climbed too high, the ambient authority of a structure that had been deciding people's fates for generations. Courtroom 7B was on the second floor. When Claire pushed through the heavy wooden door, the session had already been called to order. Every head in the room turned. She knew what they saw. A woman in blood-stained scrubs and a battered military jacket, hair still pulled back in the practical knot of someone who had not thought about her hair since the previous morning, walking into a room full of pressed suits and studied composure. At the defense table, Mason looked up. Something moved across his face, gratitude and dread arriving at exactly the same moment. Judge Everett Sloan noticed her from the bench with the particular attention of a man who organized his understanding of the world by how things appeared. He had been presiding over this courtroom for 19 years, long enough to have developed the unshakable conviction that he could determine the character of anyone who walked through those doors within the first 30 seconds. He raised one hand. "Stop right there." Claire stopped. Sloan looked at her the way a man looks at something that has been brought into his house without permission. His voice carried easily across the room he had spent 2 decades making sure it always did. He informed her that her appearance was an affront to the dignity of these proceedings, that the clothing she was wearing was inappropriate for a court of law, and he used the word filthy with a precision that suggested he had been waiting for an opportunity to use it in exactly this context. Claire explained that she had come directly from a 36-hour shift following a mass casualty event on Interstate 5. She explained that she had not had time to change. Her voice was level, the same voice she used when she was telling a family in the waiting room, something they did not want to hear, not unkind, but incapable of being softened into something easier. Sloan was not interested in the explanation. He told her that the jacket was a piece of military paraphernalia and that she would remove it before she was permitted to approach the witness stand. He said it with the finality of someone who had never once been told no and expected that to continue. "I'd prefer to keep it on," Claire said. "I can't explain why right now, but I'm asking." The room was very quiet. Sloan's expression shifted in the way of a man who has just been handed a challenge he did not anticipate and is deciding how much force to use in response. He told her that her preferences were not relevant in his courtroom. He told her that she could comply or she could be held in contempt, remanded for 48 hours, and have her testimony struck from the record entirely. At the defense table, Mason caught Claire's eye. He gave the smallest shake of his head, barely a movement at all, the kind of signal that exists between people who have learned to communicate in compression. It meant, "Don't do this for me." It meant, "I know what's under that jacket and I'm not worth it." The stillness of it, the complete absence of any demand, hit her somewhere behind the sternum. He was protecting her even now, even from here. She stayed where she was, Sloane's patience gave out. He directed the two court officers flanking the doors to approach the witness and assist her in complying with the court's instruction. The two men began to move. Claire's posture changed. Not dramatically, she didn't step back or raise her hands. She simply became very still, in the way of someone who has been in situations where stillness was the first line of defense. When she spoke, her voice had dropped a register shed. Something becomes something else entirely. Don't touch me. Two armed men stopped walking. They couldn't have explained afterward why they stopped. There was something in the instruction that bypassed the usual calculations and landed directly in the part of the brain that recognizes genuine authority when it hears it. Sloane leaned forward. His eyes moved to the patch on her shoulder, the embroidered black letters, the worn Velcro, the insignia below it, that he didn't recognize. He didn't know what Phantom 4 meant. He assumed it meant nothing. He said something about costumes. He said something about war games. He said it loudly enough that his voice carried through the old wooden door behind Claire. The door that, due to a quirk in the building's aging frame, had never quite sealed correctly, and which opened onto a stretch of corridor with an unusual acoustic quality that made sound travel farther than it should. Outside that door, Admiral Conrad Barrett had been standing in the hallway for 14 minutes. His interagency meeting had been delayed. A scheduling conflict between two federal agencies had pushed the start time back by 30 minutes, and his aide had suggested the waiting room on the ground floor. Barrett had declined. He did not wait well in small rooms. He had positioned himself in the corridor outside 7B, hands clasped behind his back, watching the light change at the far window running through the agenda for the afternoon meeting in his head. He was thinking about logistics when he heard the judge's voice through the imperfect door. He heard the words, Phantom 4. He did not move for 3 full seconds, 3 seconds, in which the part of his mind that had spent 30 years processing battlefield information worked through the probability of what he had just heard and arrived at a conclusion that the rest of him wasn't ready for. Then he put his hand on the door. Admiral Conrad Barrett did not open the door the way a man enters a room he has been invited into. He opened it the way a man enters a room where something is going wrong, and he is the only person who understands the full weight of what that means. The hinges made no sound. The door swung inward, and Barrett stepped through it, and the shift in the room was immediate, not because of his uniform, though 4 stars had a way of rearranging the atmosphere of any space, but because of the quality of his attention. He was looking at Claire the way you look at someone you thought you would never see again. Sloane was already drawing breath to address the intrusion when Barrett spoke first. "No one touches her." His voice carried no heat, which somehow made it more absolute than if he had shouted. He told the two court officers without looking at them that any physical contact with the woman standing at the center of that room could constitute interference with a federal matter, and that the security footage from the hallway camera was already part of a record that extended well beyond this courtroom's jurisdiction. Sloane's jaw tightened. He had spent 19 years in that chair, and in 19 years, he had developed a precise and well-defended sense of where his authority ended and where it was being challenged. This felt like the latter. He informed Barrett in language that left no ambiguity about his position that this was his courtroom, and that no officer of any branch, regardless of rank, had the standing to issue directives from the gallery without an invitation. He told Barrett's aide, who had followed the Admiral through the door, looking considerably less certain of himself, to escort the Admiral back to the hallway. Barrett did not move. He clasped his hands behind his back, a posture so deeply habitual that it seemed less like a choice and more like the default position his body returned to when the world required steadiness. He said quietly enough that it was almost a private conversation between two men who happened to be in a public room, that if the judge wanted to continue this proceeding on the record, while an ongoing interagency investigation was watching. That was certainly his right. He said he would be happy to wait outside while the court officers made physical contact with a woman whose file was sealed at the highest level of Naval Special Operations. He said it without inflection, the way you state a fact about gravity. The room held its breath. Harrison Langston, seated in the front row with the careful arrangement of a man who had paid to be comfortable in difficult rooms, was no longer comfortable. At the prosecution table, Miles Corbett had set down his pen. The jury box was very still. Sloan sat back. He had not conceded, not yet, not in any way he would have named as such. But the order to the court officers did not come. In the absence of that order, the two men drifted back toward the door, and the room reconfigured itself around the fact that Barrett was staying. Sloan told Claire in a voice that had lost some of its earlier certainty that the court would permit her to approach the stand once the matter of her attire had been resolved. Claire had been watching all of this without expression. She had spent years learning to read rooms in the seconds before things went bad. And she understood exactly what was happening. The argument had been suspended, not ended. Sloan had not changed his mind. He had simply run the calculation and found that direct confrontation with a four-star admiral on camera over a jacket was a position he could not defend publicly. But the contempt charge was still on the table. The testimony was still at risk. And Mason was still sitting at that defense table with his face turned down toward his hands, not watching, because he could not make himself watch. She made the decision the way she had made decisions in much worse places, quickly, cleanly, without waiting to see if a better option would materialize. Claire reached up and pulled the zipper down. The jacket came off in one motion. She folded it over her arm, set it on the railing beside her, and when she straightened and faced the room, there was nothing left to hide behind. From the elbow to the shoulder on both arms, her skin told a story that no one in that courtroom had been prepared for. Burned tissue, mottled and thick, ran in irregular patterns across the outer arm and up toward the joint. Surgical grafts marked the places where the damage had been deepest. There were two scars that anyone with medical or military training would have identified immediately as entry wounds, small dents, the kind that only look minor because of everything that was done afterward to keep the person alive. The scarring was extensive enough and distributed in a pattern specific enough that it was clear these injuries had come within a measurable margin of requiring bilateral amputation. On her right forearm, just below where the worst of the grafting began, there was a tattoo, the trident of the Naval Special Warfare Command, and below it, a date. The date corresponded to a classified operation in the mountains of Yemen 4 years ago that had no official name in any document available to the public. Barrett recognized the date before he recognized anything else. He had spent the better part of 4 years trying not to think about that night, which is different from not thinking about it. He had been in the operations center, hundreds of miles from the mountainside, listening through a radio to the sound of people he was responsible for running out of options. He remembered the voice that had come through the static calm in a way that shouldn't have been possible given what the situation reports were telling him. The voice that had said in the flat professional shorthand of someone focused entirely on the problem in front of them, that she had 4 casualties, 2 critical, and that she needed 12 minutes and for everyone to stop talking on the channel. He had given her the 12 minutes. She had used 11 of them. The official record said that the medic designated Phantom 4 had been evacuated with injuries severe enough to end her military service. The file had been sealed. He had never learned her name. Barrett crossed the courtroom. He walked past the gallery, past the bar, and the bailiff made no move to stop him. There was something in the Admiral's trajectory that made intervention seem beside the point. He stopped in front of Claire, close enough that they were no longer performing for the room, but simply occupying the same small piece of it. He looked at her face, not at her arms, at her face. Then he brought his right hand up in a salute, precise, formal, the kind that carries the full weight of what the gesture is supposed to mean when the rank difference makes it entirely voluntary. "My men came home because of you," he said. "All 4 of them." The room had been quiet before. Now it was the kind of quiet that happens when people understand collectively that they have just witnessed something that recontextualizes everything that came before it. Every person in that courtroom was now doing the same arithmetic, and the answer was not comfortable. At the defense table, Mason had his elbows on the wood and his face in his hands. He was not hiding. He simply could not hold his head up under the weight of what he was watching. He knew about those arms. He had never seen them, but he knew because he had been the one to set a cold water bottle on a table beside her without asking questions. And he had understood even then that the long sleeves in August were not about temperature. He had never asked, and she had never told him, and that had been the terms of whatever trust existed between them. Now she had blown the whole thing open in a federal courtroom in front of strangers for him, and there was no way to hold that without something breaking. Sloan looked at his own hands. His expression had moved through several versions of itself in the last 2 minutes, and arrived somewhere that wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite remorse, but occupied the territory between them. The place a man stands when he has done something publicly that he cannot privately justify. He told the court officers to stand down. He told Barrett's aide that the Admiral could remain as an observer. He did not apologize. Not yet. He told Claire she could approach the stand, and his voice had shed the particular authority it had carried since the session began. Claire picked up her jacket, draped it over the railing, and walked to the witness stand. The questioning from the defense moved through the established facts, her professional background, her connection to Mason through the Veterans Recovery Program, her clinical expertise in trauma medicine. Claire answered each question in the same register she had maintained since she walked in, precise, unembellished, stripped of emotional ornamentation. When Aaron Delaney Mason's defense attorney asked her to describe Mason's state of mind based on her professional assessment, she said the question was slightly wrong. She said she couldn't speak to his state of mind. She could speak to his actions, and she could explain what those actions indicated about his training and his decision-making in a high-stress situation. Miles Corbett objected before she could continue. He was a careful prosecutor who knew better than to attack a witness directly when the room's sympathy had shifted, so he attacked the methodology instead, suggesting that Claire's relationship with Mason compromised her objectivity, that her assessment was advocacy dressed as expertise. He noted with the even tone of someone who believes they are stating the obvious that Trevor Langston had been hospitalized with a fractured jaw, a shattered orbital socket, and injuries that had required surgery. Claire did not dispute the injuries. She said the injuries were in fact the point. She asked the court's permission to walk through the medical record of what had been found. When Trevor Langston arrived at the emergency room, documentation she had subsequently reviewed in full. Sloan, operating now in a more careful register than he had occupied an hour ago, granted the request. Claire laid it out with the efficiency of someone who had explained complex physiological events under conditions considerably more difficult than a courtroom. The jaw fracture, the orbital fracture, the blood and bone fragment aspiration that had begun compromising Trevor's airway within minutes of the altercation ending. Without intervention, she said Trevor Langston would have been dead before the ambulance arrived. The timeline from injury to airway failure was under 2 minutes. The intervention had not been performed by paramedics. It had been performed at the scene using the hollow tube from a disassembled ballpoint pen inserted to bypass the obstruction and maintain an open airway. She described the technique in clinical terms that left no room for ambiguity about the level of training required to execute it correctly under those conditions in that amount of time. Standard emergency medical services protocols did not include the use of improvised equipment. The pen had not come from a paramedic's bag. It had come from Mason's pocket. Corbett pushed back. He suggested that the improvised procedure could have been misattributed in the documentation or executed by emergency personnel who improvised due to equipment failure. Each suggestion was reasonable on its own. Claire addressed each one with the same patience she used when explaining a diagnosis to a family who didn't want to believe it. She walked through the evidence that the pen device had been in place and functioning when the paramedics arrived, and what that sequencing meant for who had placed it and when. A person in the grip of uncontrolled violence, she said, does not stop to save the life of the person they have just injured. The two actions, the force required to incapacitate a threat and the precision required to keep that person alive immediately afterward, are not compatible with a single psychological state. What the medical record described was not an attack. It was an intervention preceded by a use of force that the intervener had then immediately worked to mitigate. She said it without drama. She said it the way you say something that is simply true. Corbett was preparing his next objection when Claire set down the file she had been holding and looked at the judge. She said there was one additional piece of documentation she needed to introduce into evidence, something that had not appeared in the police report, something that she believed the court needed to understand had existed from the very beginning of this case. Harrison Langston's posture changed in the front row. The careful arrangement of a man who had paid to be comfortable came undone very slightly at the edges. The fracture pattern in Trevor Langston's right wrist had been documented in the emergency room intake report, and Claire had the page in front of her. She walked the court through what the imaging showed: a specific compression fracture along the radial styloid, the kind that results not from a fall or a block, but from the sudden forced rotation of a joint that is gripping something at the moment of impact. It was, she explained, a disarmament injury. The wrist breaks because the hand won't let go of what it's holding, and the person taking the weapon doesn't give it the option. Sloan looked at the police report again. He flipped through it twice the way a person flips through something they already know doesn't contain what they're looking for, still hoping. There was no weapon listed in the initial incident summary. No knife, no firearm, no object of any kind recovered at the scene or documented as evidence. The report described 3 men and an altercation, and a veteran with a history of psychological treatment. It did not describe a woman being held at knife point in an alley. Claire set the imaging report down and picked up something else, a single sheet, an evidence intake form from Pacific Mercy Medical Center, printed on the hospital's standard documentation template, signed and time-stamped. She said that when the trauma team had cut away Trevor Langston's jacket in the emergency bay to assess his injuries, an object had fallen from the interior pocket. A folding knife with a 4-inch blade in the closed position. She had been present. She had picked it up herself using a gloved hand, and she had logged it immediately. Time description, condition, location of recovery, before placing it in a sealed evidence bag and transferring it to the hospital's secure property storage where it had remained untouched since that night. She had brought the chain of custody receipt with her. The room did not erupt. It went very still instead, which was worse. The stillness of a place where everyone has just understood something at the same time, and no one is yet sure what to do with the understanding. Miles Corbett set his pen down on the table and did not pick it up again. Harrison Langston was sitting in the front row with his hands on his knees, and the projection of control he had maintained all morning was failing. In real time, his eyes had moved to Corbett and stayed there waiting for something that Corbett was not going to be able to provide. Sloan looked at Claire over the rims of his reading glasses. His voice when he spoke had lost the last of the register it had carried at the start of the session. He asked her to confirm that the knife she had documented had not been turned over to law enforcement had not appeared in any evidence log filed by the responding officers, and had not been referenced in any documentation provided to the prosecution in the preparation of this case. Claire confirmed all three. Sloan asked Corbett to explain the discrepancy. Corbett stood. He was a careful man and a good attorney, and he understood that what he said in the next 30 seconds would define the rest of this afternoon, and possibly considerably more than that. He said he had prosecuted this case based on materials provided by the investigating officers, and that he had no prior knowledge of any weapon recovered at the hospital. He said it steadily, without embellishment, because it was the only position he could take that had any structural integrity. The problem was that his steadiness in this context only made the question worse. If Corbett hadn't known about the knife, then the investigating officers had chosen not to tell him, and the reason a weapon that exculpated the defendant would be withheld from the prosecution was not a reason anyone in that room wanted to say out loud. The silence where Corbett's explanation should have been said it for them. Mason lifted his face from his hands. He had been in that position for a long time, long enough that his attorney, Aaron Delaney, had placed a hand on his shoulder at some point, though Mason hadn't fully registered it. He looked first at Claire, then at Harrison Langston, and his expression did something that no one who hadn't lived through the specific combination of relief and devastation would have been able to read correctly. He had spent 3 weeks being told that what he remembered from that alley was not what had happened. He had read the police report. He had seen his own actions described in language calibrated to make him sound like a danger to himself and everyone around him. Now he was looking at a man in the front row who had paid in some specific and documentable way for that version of events to exist. The knowledge settled into Mason's face like something very heavy coming to rest. Sloan removed his glasses. He set them on the bench and looked at the room, and what crossed his face was not the practiced judicial neutrality that courtrooms require, but something older and less managed. He was looking at a chain of custody receipt that suggested someone had decided at a very early point in this case that the truth was negotiable. And he was aware in a way he could not entirely suppress that he had nearly helped that negotiation succeed by throwing the one witness who could expose it out of his courtroom because of what she was wearing. He ordered the knife retrieved from Pacific Mercy's property storage and transferred immediately to the court's custody. He directed that the evidence intake records be entered into the case file. He told Corbett that the matter of the missing weapon documentation was being referred to the presiding judge of the criminal division for a review, and that the investigating officers named in the original incident report would be required to provide written explanations for the discrepancy within 72 hours. He said the words obstruction and misconduct in the flat procedural tone of a man who is being very careful not to say more than he can currently support. But the words were in the room now, and they were not going to leave. Then he looked at the case file in front of him, the medical documentation, the chain of custody receipt, the imaging report describing a wrist injury consistent with forcible disarmament, the clinical analysis of an improvised airway procedure performed in under 2 minutes on the man who had just been threatening a woman with a knife. He closed the file. He said that based on the totality of the evidence presented, and in light of material that had been demonstrably absent from the original prosecution case, he was dismissing all charges against Mason Keene, effective immediately. Mason didn't stand up right away. Aaron Delaney was already on his feet saying something Mason couldn't process, and the room had shifted into the low-frequency noise of a place where something significant has just happened, and the people in it are still deciding how to respond. Mason sat in his chair for a moment longer than he needed to, and then he stood, and he walked to where Claire was gathering her documents at the witness stand. He stopped about a foot away from her. There was no gesture that felt adequate to what had just happened. The jacket, the scars, the years she had spent keeping those scars covered, all of it deployed in a federal courtroom for a man who had once set a cold water bottle on a table because he knew better than to ask. His eyes went red before the tears came, and when they did, he didn't try to stop them. He stood in front of her and let them fall, and she looked back at him with an expression that was tired and certain, in equal measure the expression of someone who made a decision and has no regrets about it and is simply waiting for the weight of it to finish settling. At the front of the room, Sloan asked the Langston family and Miles Corbett to remain in the courtroom. He told Harrison Langston that the investigation would include a review of any communications between the Langston family and the officers involved in the original inquiry, and that he would be strongly advised to have legal counsel present for whatever came next. Harrison Langston said nothing. Paige Moreno, who had been sitting in the back row of the gallery, was approached quietly by a victim's advocate from the district attorney's office within 20 minutes of the dismissal. She was told that the situation had changed. The knife had been recovered. The charges against Mason had been dismissed, and the people who had visited her 3 weeks ago no longer had the same leverage. Paige listened, and then she nodded, and then she asked for a glass of water and a pen because she had something she wanted to put in writing before she changed her mind. Sloan asked Claire to approach the bench before she left. He kept his voice low enough that the gallery couldn't hear him clearly. He told her that the court owed her an apology plainly, without the lawyerly qualifications that might have softened the accountability of it. He said that he had allowed his judgment to be determined by how a person looked, rather than what she had to say, and that this had nearly resulted in a serious miscarriage of justice. Claire accepted the apology without performance, without telling him it was fine when it hadn't been. She picked up her jacket from the railing, put it on, and zipped it up. Outside, the marble corridor was cooler than the courtroom had been. The nerve pain in Claire's arms had moved from a background signal to something more insistent it always did when the adrenaline that usually kept it manageable started to recede. She walked toward the main exit and found Barrett standing beside the tall window at the end of the hall, looking out at the street below. He turned when he heard her footsteps. He told her without preamble that he had been trying to locate Phantom 4 for 4 years. Claire told him that Phantom 4 had not survived Yemen. The person who had was a nurse in San Diego, and those were different things, and the distinction mattered to her. Barrett said he understood the distinction, and that he was going to disagree with it anyway, because the thing that had kept 4 men alive in a cave in the mountains of Yemen was not a military designation. It was a particular quality of a particular person, and that quality had been in this building today, and it was not the kind of thing that disappeared just because the uniform came off. He reached into his jacket and took out a coin, the Naval Special Warfare Command Challenge coin, its face worn smooth in the way of something that has spent years in a pocket. He placed it in Claire's hand. He told her that there was a position available at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado for a senior instructor in combat trauma management, and that if she ever wanted it, he would make one call and consider it the smallest debt he had ever repaid. Claire turned the coin over once between her fingers. Then she put it in her jacket pocket next to her phone, which had a notification she already knew the content of the Veterans Recovery Program coordinator, asking if she could stop by before her next shift. A new participant hadn't spoken to anyone since arriving, sitting alone in the corner of the waiting room. The coordinator thought Claire might know what to do with that. She thanked Barrett. She told him the next shift started in 12 hours, and that Pacific Mercy still had patients who needed her more than Coronado did. He gave her a slight nod, not the formal salute of the courtroom, just the acknowledgement one person gives another when they recognize that the right thing has been said. Claire pushed through the heavy glass door and came out into the San Diego afternoon. The city moved around her the way it always did, indifferent, continuous, full of people who had no idea what had happened in Courtroom 7B and no reason to know. She turned toward the parking structure and kept walking. The olive jacket zipped to the throat, the coin in her pocket, the pain in her arms doing what it always did. She had never needed the world to know her name. She needed to be somewhere she was useful, and she knew exactly where that was. There's something this story keeps coming back to that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. The judge saw a dirty jacket and made his decision in 30 seconds. The police report saw a veteran with a trauma history and built an entire case around that assumption. Harrison Langston saw a system he could afford to bend and assumed it would stay bent. Every single one of them was wrong, not because they lacked information, but because they stopped looking the moment they thought they already understood. Claire didn't win because she was a hero. She won because she showed up with evidence, with precision, and with the willingness to pay a personal cost for someone else's truth. Those aren't military qualities. Those are human ones. We walk past people like Claire every single day, people carrying things we can't see, choosing quietly to show up for someone else anyway. The least we can do is not make up our minds about them before they've had the chance to speak. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one, the kind that remind you what people are actually capable of, subscribe so you're here for the next one. We'll see you then.